Today, the FBI is announcing a domestic terror investigation into the Gilroy, California shooting, which hit before El Paso and Dayton.
The shooter appeared to have an interest in varying, competing violent ideologies. Due to the discovery of the target list, as well as other information we have encountered in this investigation, the FBI has opened a full domestic terrorism investigation into this mass shooting.
The El Paso shooting also under investigation as terror, domestic terror, and specifically white nationalist terror is on the rise. We know that. And there are renewed debates over how to combat it and whether it should be basically a 9/11 style priority. That's part of the call from people with gravitas on that very score, the chairs of the widely heralded 9/11 Commission. Now, the point here is not to abstractly say, gosh, every big, deadly problem should just be tackled like 9/11. The point is security experts telling us that the facts show these domestic shootings are now on par with the current foreign terror threat. Now, that's a security fact that may not have sunk in yet in our society or in our politics. But these experts are pointing to statistics like this. The people killed in attacks linked to Islamic radicals and the far right since 2002 are, as you see here, virtually the same, basically 104 to 109. Now, there are legal challenges as well. Federal officials can disrupt foreign terrorist plots with different levels of intensity to preventive action and the right that they were basically fortified after 9/11. Former FBI agent Ali Soufan spent 25 years fighting jihadists. He says white supremacists aren't so different from a law enforcement perspective, saying we can't fight domestic terror groups efficiently until the law treats them the way we treat foreign ones. But with domestic terrorism, officials are more limited. New York Times reports that, of course, the First Amendment and other domestic civil liberties concerns makes preventing these terror acts committed by Americans much more challenging. Now, the FBI in California today addressed this difficulty in starting a domestic terror probe.
An act of violence alone, even a large scale and horrifying as it may seem, does not necessarily give us the legal authority to open a federal terrorism investigation. We have to determine that individual's ideology caused them to commit the act of violence in furtherance of their political and social goals.
I'm joined now by Daryl Johnson, a former senior analyst for domestic terror at DHS, the author of the new book, Hateland, an in-depth look at, yes, domestic terror here in America, and former federal prosecutor Joyce Vance, who has national security experience, obviously, as a U.S. attorney. Thanks for both of you being here. Daryl, how do you view it?
Yeah, I mean, this topic of domestic terrorism is basically a political minefield. You're talking about very divisive topics in America, things like gun rights, abortion rights, immigration, and other things. And, you know, the concern that I have is the backlash that I was subjected to back in 2009 has a chilling effect on both the law enforcement and intelligence communities. So you have a reluctance on the part of federal agencies to pursue these issues because they saw what happened to me and my unit and how it got shut down and people were fired.
Let's dig into that for a moment, because part of the thing about, especially immediately after 9/11, was if you could link anything to 9/11, it fortified it in Washington, whether it was a government reorg or funding or taking more extreme measures. And there are legitimate civil liberties balancing, as I mentioned. Tell us what you meant about the political blowback you experienced.
Yeah, so we wrote a report back in 2009 that used the term right-wing extremism, which I guess some people in Congress took that as meaning the Republican Party or the Tea Party. We also had a vague definition buried in a footnote that was taken out of context that talked about how these groups are generally anti-government or hate-based. And then the third issue that was raised was the point we connected the returning military veterans being susceptible to recruitment into these groups.
Joyce, how much of this is harder for what we might simplify as good reasons, like it is supposed to be harder to go on a war footing inside the United States border as opposed to when you have foreign terrorists coming in? And how much of it is for what we might call bad reasons, like things being either political, as Daryl mentions, or just being out of date?
You know, it's really difficult for both reasons, Ari. Some legitimate, some illegitimate. It's incredibly important that law enforcement priorities be set on the basis of data, not ideology. We have a lot of data that tells us that domestic terrorism has been steadily increasing and that threat needs to be addressed. So that's the data that people should focus on. At the same time, though, there are legitimate civil rights concerns, First Amendment concerns, and you'll recall that when the Patriot Act was first passed, there were a lot of privacy concerns that were implicated by it. So we want to make sure that in this particular moment, we don't go too far, that we appropriately balance the equities and give law enforcement the tools that it needs. Fortunately, law enforcement has a lot of tools. There are a lot of statutory bases. They may not be designated as terrorism, and it would be nice to have a domestic terrorism statute, but they can still use some of the other statutes, particularly the hate crime statute. The real matter here is resources and personnel. Domestic terrorism needs to be identified as a priority for FBI offices. Prosecutors need to have the resources to prosecute it like they've historically had since 9/11 for foreign terrorism.
Daryl, how about that?
Yeah, I agree with everything that she said. And in my office, we had what was called intelligence oversight, where we had files that were inspected annually. We got training, and we were also subjected to unannounced inspections of our files to make sure that we weren't violating people's First Amendment rights or Third Amendment rights of free assembly.
And so is there a main change you would make to federal law if you could, Daryl?
Well, as your other guest pointed out, a domestic terrorism statute might be a step in the right direction to add penalty enhancements if you commit an act of domestic terror. I think the first thing that needs to be done is, our government leaders, police chiefs, directors of federal law enforcement agencies, when they see this ideology that spurs someone to violence, call it terrorism. We shouldn't be dismissing it by saying it's a crazed gunman or the person's mentally ill. That has nothing to do with whether it's terrorism or not.
Yeah, and both of you are speaking to the reality that I think viewers know, and that is increasingly becoming a point of organizing action, which is if any foreign entity, ISIS or you name it, came in and did all this weekend with the same body count, would there be a clamoring to do something national, whether it's what you're talking about, some of these reforms packaged together, whether it's gun safety, or if it were a foreign entity, it would be how do you go hit them back? And yet here we are with a Congress in recess and a president, as we've covered this hour, doing double talk. Daryl and Joyce, thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.